Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to our presentation this afternoon. You are here to hear us talk about a new screening instrument called Ness, and the title of our presentation is Using an Ecological Perspective to Screen Young Children for Developmental Risk and Resilience. My name is Dr. Carmela DeCandia. I'm a child psychologist by training. I've also worked in the homeless field. I've worked in a variety of settings, both as a provider, as a researcher, and a trainer. And I'm the president and founder of Artemis Associates, a consulting firm that helps programs build their services to support the resilience of children and families. And I'm here with my partner, Katie Volk, and I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Katie Volk. I am a child development specialist with the Center for Social Innovation based in Boston. We work around the country providing training and technical assistance. We do a lot of good public health research. My own background is particularly in homelessness, poverty, and child development, and of course, if you're studying all of those things, trauma. And I'm delighted to be here with you all today.
Great, thanks Katie. Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to go through talking about this new tool, and we want to talk about what is screening and how it can help, and why we've chosen to develop this tool. We'll talk to you about what Ness is and how we went ahead and developed it, talk through the findings and some of the results of the national study that we did on developing it, and show you a demonstration before we wrap up. So we've got a lot to do in the next hour. So first of all, assessment and screening. We just want to make sure we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about as a screening tool. And an assessment tool, obviously, is something that's very targeted, very deep. As a psychologist, I do a lot of testing of kids, and you're often using multiple tools, you're going very deep, and you're often trying to diagnose or evaluate an issue. Screening, obviously, a broader concept, really trying to get a sense, not a diagnostic tool, but really trying to see the potential for a particular issue that you are looking for. In our case, issues of risk or resilience. So we are talking about a screening tool today. So why do we screen for developmental risk, and particularly with this population, which is really a low-income population that is a very racially diverse population? So there were 4 critical needs really from the literature base and from experience that we really came across. First of all, the need for standardized screening is really critical. In terms of reducing bias across providers, improving the accuracy of our results, as opposed to just kind of from our gut, taking a look at a kid and kind of saying, well, I think something's off. But instituting a screening tool obviously will increase the accuracy of the results. And when we're talking about a workforce that is very, very broad across child-serving systems, we're often talking about a paraprofessional workforce. So we want to embed some standardization into their ability to screen kids so that we really know which kids need further assessment and which ones don't. There were 4 critical needs from the population that we really looked at and that we were targeting. So this really comes from the literature. First of all, the kids and the prevalence of developmental delay among children, particularly kids in different populations. You'll see, what the prevalence is overall for all kids in the United States, but when you start looking at kids in poverty, that number goes up pretty significantly to about a quarter kids. And then when you look at kids in homelessness, the number is pretty strong and pretty high, that about a quarter of homeless children under the age of 5 are meeting criteria for at least 1 developmental delay. And that's been pretty consistent across the research. So kids in poverty, kids across different racial groups, and certainly kids who are homeless, which is a subset of that population, much higher need. Then there's the issue of the caregiver, right? We're looking at this from an ecological frame, so we're not just looking at kids. We're looking at the risks among caregivers. And one of the things we know is that depression among caregivers can be extraordinarily high when you compare all women to women in poverty. And then when you look at homeless women and mothers, a subset of that population, the numbers go as high as a quarter for women in poverty, 25%, to as high as 85% for mothers experiencing homelessness. And that range is anywhere from 50 to 85% when you look at different studies. But the research is really consistent, and it really is quite an unacknowledged healthcare issue among mothers who are at severe poverty and also experiencing residential instability. The other issue for this caregiver group is the issue of trauma. You cannot look at these issues and separate out depression, particularly among mothers, where the research has been done, and the issue of interpersonal trauma. The rates for all women, again, hover around 9%. When you look at the rates for women in poverty and homelessness, they skyrocket. And so I don't know if you know, but homeless mothers, 93% of homeless mothers have a lifetime history of trauma, mostly domestic violence, but often childhood physical and sexual abuse. And of that group, 30 to 36% meet criteria for PTSD. Again, these are not women that are typically getting screened or getting any kind of treatment. So we can imagine the impact on their parenting. We go broader out from the caregiver environment. We look at the ecological context of and the environmental factors that are affecting kids in high poverty settings. And we know from various presentations what we've heard from their environment matters, the zip code matters, where they are, their economic status, issues of nutrition. We looked into the literature and really looked at which of these factors are really ones that we can measure and target and maybe include in an overall ecological tool. And you'll see the ones in blue are the ones that we actually targeted in our Ness tool, because these are issues that are very high prevalence for kids living in poverty and particularly for kids with experiencing homelessness, so that whole broad spectrum of kids. Now, we know that for developmental screening to be effective, it needs to begin early in life, right? It has to be repeated throughout childhood, and we need to use valid and reliable tools that are appropriate for the age, culture, language, gender of the child, right? We have to target our tools to the contextual kind of risk of the child and their demographics. That can be extremely challenging when you start to look at tools because very few tools, and there are great ones out there, but very few have been developed and normed specifically on low-income kids from racially diverse backgrounds. So we wanted to get a tool that was really developed with this population in mind and really see what we were going to get so that we could really target their needs in particular. The fourth critical need is the workforce. The workforce is very broad. Not a lot of child psychologists in the homeless system or working in low-income, low-resource settings. So we have a huge paraprofessional workforce. We have teachers. We have childcare providers. We have a lot of folks who often don't have the time, the money, the expertise, or the training in order to be able to use some of the great assessment tools that are out there. So not only did we want to develop a tool specific to a certain population of kids and families, but we wanted to develop a tool that could get in the hands of the people working, quote unquote, on the front lines, so that when they came to me, they were able to give me some information. So this is a very difficult task, right? If we were to look at the kids, you can imagine some of the gold standard instruments, you'd have to choose one of those tools. And we know that when we're looking at them, the norms of those tools, as good as they are, they're very much more focused on white middle class kids. And some have subgroup normative data, but you have to know enough to read the manual to go in there and figure that out. Not something that groups in low resource settings can do. But then you want to look ecologically, so then you have to kind of pull from a variety of caregiver tools. Depression, anxiety, various mental health ones, social support, substance use, and then you want to look at the environment, and there are lots of good environmental tools out there. So now you have to put all these things together, and as a psychologist, it's something I do, and then you have to combine all that together to figure out recommendations. Again, not something that the workforce, who has about 15 minutes to see and maybe interact with a family, can do, especially without that training. That decision-making matrix is not necessarily there to work very quickly. And that is where I found myself when I was the vice president of St. Mary's Women and Children's Center in Dorchester, Massachusetts. I was working there for 12 years, the only clinician and psychologist there, 100 families, lots of kids, and the staff would come to me all the time and say, could you take a look at this kid? Could you take a look at this kid? And I would see kids and very quickly be able to say, okay, refer this kid, let's get something for the parent on this kid. But there was no way to keep up. It was unsustainable. I couldn't hire clinicians. I couldn't bring more in. The system didn't support that. And I remember going back to my office after seeing this one kid. It's embedded in my mind and kind of sitting there going, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be some way that I can give my frontline direct care staff some way of being able to bring this information in a more standardized way, and said, we just need a tool. And we need a tool. And then here we are 25 years later, and we've managed to get funding and create this tool. And so we've created this tool called Ness, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Katie and let her tell you what Ness is exactly.
Carmela's a little taller than I am, even when I wear heels. Hi, everyone. So we created Ness. Ness stands for the Neurodevelopmental Ecological Screening Tool. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it really does capture exactly what this tool is all about. So it's neurodevelopmental. We're looking at kids developmentally, but it's ecological. As we've heard again and again and again, and as you all know from your work, kids don't develop in a vacuum. They develop surrounded by an ecology. So if their parents are doing well, the kids are probably doing all right. If the environment is terrible and the parents are doing all right and the kids are struggling, you pull on each of these strings and you get a different outcome. And so we wanted something that was going to be ecological in nature. And then, as Carmela discussed, it's a screening tool meant to take a look at kids across a whole range of things. And it follows the best practices around screening. So it's brief. It takes somewhere between 15 and 30 minutes to complete. I should also say it's an online tool. So you sit next to one another, parent, caregiver, case manager, look at the computer screen. It's a series of multiple choice questions that goes through. And at the end of this, we'll show you a little demo. And it takes, like I said, between 15 and 30 minutes to complete. It focuses on a selected area of interest. So we're focusing on the child's risk and resilience for developmental delay. That is really where all of the questions have been targeted to. It's ideal for broad use. If you have a child who already has identified significant developmental issues, this is not going to be your screening tool, but for more broad use. And it's targeted. This is for 3 to 5-year-olds. So it's targeted to young children. Typically, the way that we develop this, it's typically most appropriate for kids living in low resource or working in low resource settings. So poverty, homelessness, WIC offices, Head Starts, those kinds of things. Nest is really grounded deeply in the theory, and that was something that was really important to us, to take what we know about the research base and the theory and build on that and develop something very practical. It combines decades of research around child development with the best of what we know about computerized clinical decision-making tools. It's also beautiful to look at, which you'll see at the end of this. So we looked at a variety of literatures to put Nest together. Child development literature has quite a bit to say about what puts kids at risk or what helps them be resilient around developmental outcomes. We looked at caregiver functioning, and caregiver, we had initially quite a massive list, but how do you narrow that down? So we looked at caregiver functioning around mental health, particularly depression and trauma, and parenting skill. And so those are the areas that Nest is embedded in. We also looked at environmental influences, so residential instability, food security, quality of play spaces, healthcare access, and put that all together. We also looked at existing measures. So what are the screeners and assessment tools out there that people are using, and what are they looking at? I will say that many, if not all of them, are not ecological. As Carmela showed, it can be very hard to piece things together to come up with recommendations. And so we also consulted experts. We had an expert panel that advised us. We talked a lot with parents who were the best informants of how to form these items. We would sit in our offices and struggle with how to phrase a particular question or what should the choices be, and then we'd sit across the table from a mom and she would say, "This is how you ask it." And we'd say, "Oh, yes. Okay, well, what do you think about this one?" And that was some of the most informative part of our research, as it always is. It's a lesson we learn again and again. At the end of the day, we did cognitive testing with 20 families and 10 providers in the Massachusetts area, which was where our pilot was, and then we expanded it to a bigger study. Ultimately, when we took all of this information, what we came up with is the 3 domains we had mentioned earlier. So we look at children and how they're faring neurodevelopmentally. This looks like a typical screening tool. It covers gross and fine motor, executive function, functional communication, and social and emotional well-being. Then it looks at caregiver. well-being. It asks about depression, trauma, and parenting. And for the ones, I know it's tiny, but the ones with the stars next to them, we actually embedded existing measures that exist in the public domain, which gives this more, so this is psychometrically validated, but this gives it some stronger psychometrics in those areas. So for depression, for example, we embedded the PHQ-9, which is a depression screener that's in the public domain. That's embedded within Nest. And then we also looked at the environmental influences. Food security, housing, lead exposure, health, and then child ACEs. And we're going to report on a lot of this at the end of the presentation here. So we took all of that and came up with a logic model for how does all of this fit together? Because the idea is you ask these questions, and then it filters down to some kind of very practical score and report for risk and resilience, right? So what does that look like? This is what it looks like. So you can see here, down here is the Neurodevelopmental Composite. It consists of all of these constructs, and then there's subconstructs underneath that. So for example, executive functioning, we broke out into neurocognitive and adaptability and coping. And within those, there's cognitive processing, problem solving, attention, impulse control, everyday challenges, and emotional regulation. For social emotional development, that breaks out into social skills and play. And then we get into the caregiver, which I talked about, and the environment. And so we put all of those things together. This is our one methodology slide. So what we did is we created an item pool that was in the neighborhood of 268 questions, which is too many. And we whittled it down. So we vetted it with experts. We refined the items through cognitive testing. We refined it a lot. We conducted a small pilot in Massachusetts. We refined the items again, and then we conducted a larger study. So this started 3 years ago. It's actually coming to an end. Our funding is coming to an end. We hope the project lives on for many years. In our phase 1 pilot study, just to test whether or not this would work, we worked with 5 programs in Massachusetts, 60 parents. So I should say that, I think this is clear, but just to make sure it's very clear, this is a screener that parents answer on behalf of their children. So these are not questions that the kids use. Generally speaking, the kids weren't even in the room when the parents were asked the questions, just to make certain that's clear. Our inclusion criteria was children ages 3 to 5 experiencing homelessness. So when children experience homelessness, they are at the intersection of a lot of different services and systems and vulnerabilities, which is one of the reasons we chose to target that population for our study. The caregiver had to understand English at least a 5th grade level. Nest is written in English. We would love to have it translated at some point. For the research study, though, we had to make sure that when we were asking the questions, the parents understood the questions we were asking. So that was that. The result was that it worked. And it worked beautifully. Caregivers reported really liking the opportunity to answer the questions. Providers found it really easy to go through. It opened up conversations between providers and caregivers, which was one of our intentions. Providers would say, well, I always wanted to ask about these couple things because I noticed, but I never quite knew how to introduce it. So after we finished the screening tool, we had these conversations, which was really just music to our ears, as I'm sure you can imagine. Out of all of the items that we tested, about 2/3 worked really well, and about 1/3 needed more refining. So again, we went through this constant process of refining the items. One of the adjustments we made is that we wanted to ask, play is such a critical component of early childhood, but it's a really hard thing to ask about in a multiple choice online tool. And so we went through again and again, and we put some questions in there, and to be quite honest, the first version of them totally tanked. It didn't tell us much at all. There was a lot of noise in the statistics, and even when we reread them, it was like, it's not quite getting at. So we went back to the literature and looked at it in a lot of depth again, and coming back to our original concept where we're really looking at risk and resilience. When you look at a child's play, what really helps to determine risk or resilience for that child? Well, according to the literature, it really is focusing on imaginative play and social play, and looking at that higher, is the child developing and increasing higher order thinking, which is what imaginative play is helping them develop. So we targeted our questions to those areas, and that worked really well. We also looked at the parenting scale, and parenting, again, is a very hard thing to ask about in general, but I think particularly in an online multiple choice tool where there's so much social pressure and stigma and those kinds of things. We refocused on the things that predict risk and resilience, and that really looked like overreactive versus, losing my word here, lax, thank you. I was thinking lax parenting. And so what you want is to be somewhere in the middle, right? And overreactive parenting in particular is associated with some pretty tough child outcomes. And so we wanted to measure that. So that's the scale that got embedded there. And then we looked at the environmental scale and thought it didn't quite cover a broad enough waterfront for the kinds of things that we wanted to make sure we included. So we added a lead screener, we added healthcare access and nutrition kinds of questions as well. So we started with 268 items. We whittled it down, and we ended with the final tool of 105 items in our screening tool. When we conducted phase 2 testing, we worked with 9 sites across the country. We trained case managers. So in the first iteration of Ness, we did a lot of the training. In this case, we trained case managers to use Ness. We had a sample size of 230 parents of children ages 3 to 5. We also administered gold standard assessments to a subsample to see whether the gold standards were picking up on the same things that Nest was picking up on, so we could get some of those really solid psychometrics. And we did that, again, with a subsample, but across the country. One of our sites was right here in Texas, in Fort Worth. Fun fact. So our sample, fortunately, was broken down, and this was not by design. We recruited whoever we could take, but our sample actually broke down very evenly across age, 3, 4, and 5, and gender as well, 52% male, 48% female. Racially, 84% of our sample was non-white, which was, we weren't recruiting specifically for that, but given the programs we were recruiting, it was not a surprise to us. The average age for the caregiver was 30, but it was a really broad range. So caregiver we defined as whoever was the primary person taking care of the child. In most cases, it was the mother. I think the youngest mom we had was 18 or 19, but we also had a grandmother fill it out who was in her early 70s, and kind of everybody in between. The caregivers were also primarily non-white. We recruited from homeless programs, so the very low income and poverty, and again, recruited across the country. Do I hand off to you now? Yeah, there you go.
So as Katie mentioned, we did a number of different psychometric, empirical kind of based things. Our statistician would get very techie if he was here and told you about it. But we did a couple of things to validate it. So we used 3 gold standard tools, the Vineland, the BASC for child behavior, the Vineland for development, and the PSI-4, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, the parent stress inventory, look at parenting behaviors. So we really wanted to, particularly, obviously, for depression or trauma, these were already validated scales, so we didn't need to validate those. So we used these scales to validate the items that we created in some of the other scales. So being able to make sure we were measuring the right construct, and we were measuring it with the sensitivity that the gold standards were measuring it. The existing tools you can see that we pulled environmentally and from the mental health field, and we used item response theory, confirmatory factor analysis, a variety of statistical models that actually correct for the fact that it was a smaller sample than maybe these 2,000 person samples, but these kind of statistical methods kind of mediate that smaller sample. So take a look at what we found. First of all, let's talk about the tool. It's only as good as it's valid and reliable. So we did find that the tool was reliable. That was the first thing we looked at, were the items, that's what internal item fit, were the items fitting together? Were they all kind of measuring, if it's play and symbolic play, were they all measuring the same thing? That doesn't tell us whether symbolic play was the right thing, right? But it tells us whether we're all 3 or 4 items in that scale, we're picking up the same thing. And you'll see that the range was 0.77 to 1.6. That's solidly within a good high reliability frame. Also, we did a small sample of test-retest. If you took it now and took it 6 weeks from now, are you reporting the same thing? So we didn't have any trouble with reliability. We felt like it's reliably measuring something, but is it valid? Because validity is really what matters. So we tested the validity against the gold standards to see were we measuring the right constructs and at the sensitivity level. And the alpha range was solid within the adequate to good range. So we were pretty pleased with that what we were measuring and what the gold standards we're measuring were coming out pretty much the same. And so we were solid in that way. And of course, we have additional empirical support from the existing tools. So we felt like at this point, psychometrically, we've actually got a pretty solid tool that we felt confident that if it was in the hands of paraprofessionals on the front line, it would validly and reliably pick up what they're looking for. So taking a look at the neurodevelopmental composite, and as Katie mentioned, you'll see the self-regulation, executive function. You can look at the literature and go back and forth and say chicken and egg. Is it executive function that incorporates self-regulation? Is self-regulation incorporate executive function? And really, we looked at it and said, they're both kind of executive function, but when you put them together, it's all an aspect of self-regulation. So, and these constructs and subconstructs, as Katie mentioned, were particularly chosen out of all the possible things that you could pick in these large bodies of literature. These were the ones that kept rising to the top over and over again about predicting levels of risk in child development. Or resilience, if you were stronger in these areas. So that's why we were kind of targeting in on the specific constructs that we put into Ness. So in the neurodevelopmental domain, the child domain, what we found was that we had 100% sensitivity. When you get a score, and Katie will show you this when we do the demonstration, it ends up translating for the parent as a low risk, moderate risk, or high risk. And in that scoring, we had 100% sensitivity, meaning that every child that scored at risk on one of the gold standards was also scoring at risk on ours. So we had high sensitivity, and that was purposeful. We had a lower specificity. So that means that you're going to have a certain amount of false positives. There's going to be a small group of kids that don't have a delay, but might show up on Nest as a delay. So our specificity is 65%, which is moderate. But when you go for high sensitivity, you're going to always have a little bit lower specificity. And we did this purposely. We had a lot of discussion about the clinical utility of this tool. You can't be over-relying on the data and have 100% because you want it to be in the hands of people who are going to use it practically, who may not have the training to know when to override what the tool is telling you. I might do a test with a kid and I'm doing something, but I'm seeing the kid looks very different than the test is showing, and you have to use some judgment to know how to balance that. We want to build in protection in our tool that no kid is going to be missed, and if one or two kids accidentally get screened in and you do a further assessment and they find that they're okay, then that's okay with us, because it's really about what's practical in the community. So we're comfortable with our sensitivity and specificity, and then we looked at it and we created it, and because of the numbers in our age groups, we were able to age adjust it. So the Nest will be done at every 6-month intervals, starting from age 3 to age 5. And so the data was able to support the developmental level for kids in a 3 to 3.5 age group, and then 3.6 to 3.11, and so on and so forth. So it's age adjusted. It's one tool for 6 categories across these 2 years of development. So it's very ambitious to try and get this all in one screening tool for folks. So we were comfortable that our neurodevelopmental domain was measuring the constructs validly, it was reliable, it was balanced and valid against gold standards. We were comfortable with the sensitivity and specificity. We felt strong about that. We looked at the caregiver domain. Obviously, we looked at mental health and parenting, and as you know, just intuitively, they're two related, and they're highly related. So what we found in our sample, which is very consistent with the literature for women, not just in high poverty settings, but also experiencing homelessness, is very high rates of maternal depression. Not a surprise. I've heard just from the 2 presentations earlier about the need to really integrate maternal depression screeners in child development screening. So this was, and having worked in the homelessness field and knowing what the rates are and that it's undiagnosed and untreated, and seeing the impact on the kids, this was really important to us. And what you'll see is about half of the sample met criteria on the PHQ-9 for mild to moderate depression. That's pretty staggering when you compare it to all women, which is, I can't remember, 9%, I think it was. So half the sample, no depression, but half the sample met criteria for depression. Similar for trauma and the PCL, which looks at PTSD symptoms, consistent with the literature, about 1/3 of the sample met criteria for possible PTSD. And you can see the different types of symptoms that the PCL targets, which are classic PTSD symptoms. So here we have a sample that is very high, the caregivers who are probably have depression and trauma and probably both, and are parenting very young children. And when we looked at this relationship a little bit, what's interesting is that on the parenting scale, a lot of the parents rated as effective. There's a subsample that are rating as ineffective, which means they're overreactive parenting styles. But there's a lot of strong parents. And when you work with families, you know that they go to any odds to protect their child. And that buffering that the parent provides really supports the resilience of children. There's a subset of kids who are homeless that are quite resilient, and you wonder why, and you have to look at this relationship and what gets mediated through the parent. But for the parent to hold on and be able to parent in such an effective way, that parent needs support. And you'll see that depression and trauma was highly correlated. 70% was an overlap. Most parents who had depression also had trauma, and likely PTSD and trauma. And for women, that's very common. So we can't look at depression separate from trauma histories in these populations. What we also found was that for the parents where their depression scores were higher, on the neurodevelopmental composite, the issue of social emotional skills and self-regulation went down. It didn't hit the motor development, it didn't hit the language as much, but self-regulation and social emotional, though kids looked worse on that scoring when the parents were depressed. So now you see that there's clearly a relationship. Then when you look at, well, how does parenting impact this? And we're still digging into some of the data around this. It's really bringing home the issue of the need to treat an entire family. Because you'll see that these have independent outcomes. So a parent who's depressed impacts the child domain score. Depression up, child domain score goes down in certain construct areas. Similar, if you have overreactive parenting, but you're not coming out as depressed and you have overreactive parenting, the child domain score goes down as well. So there's some independent, but when you put them together, it adds another 10th. So for each thing that's going on for the caregiver, the child score gets a little bit worse. Depression can get a little worse. Parenting, overreactive can get a little worse. Put them together, it gets a little worse. So there's small effects, but when you add those up, you realize that that becomes an intervention point about where we need to add support. To support that child, we need to be supporting that parent in their parenting and their mental health. Of course, then we looked at the environment composite. And this is just a snapshot. Remember that this is a restricted sample of high poverty, also homeless families, so we're going to see high rates, but they're pretty staggering when you look at this population and the level of risk that's in this population of 3 to 5-year-olds. Most had moved more than 4 times, high rates of residential instability, lots of issues about not feeling that they had a place that was healthy and safe, using the ER as a form of primary care, having food insecurity and hunger, delaying medical care. So a lot of health access, food insecurity, and residential instability. You know, we know that there is a lot of correlation between these environmental factors and kids' outcomes. In our sample, we found some weak and small effect sizes. So if you looked at any one of those things, there was a small effect size, not as big as the caregiver, but you have to remember that this is a highly restricted sample, so you have to be cautious about that. I'm not saying that these environmental factors don't have a big impact on kids. I'm saying in our sample, which is highly restrictive, you don't see the bigger effect size. If we did this with a larger, more diverse sample, we'd probably see the diversity of the effect sizes across kids. So just a caution and interpretation. So as we've heard earlier, and we saw this earlier in the plenary, that the more risk factors are piling up on kids, the more likely that they're going to experience developmental delay. And when you get up to 6 or more, the likelihood is nearly universal that there's going to be some impact on development. And those kind of risk factors relate to what we see in the adverse childhood experiences, which is something we embedded in our scale. We looked at the adverse childhood experiences of the kids. And there's an emerging literature base. I'm going to let Katie do some talking about what we found around ACEs in our population.
So we looked at adverse childhood experiences, and there is not one standard scale for ACEs for children. Usually ACEs are done retrospectively. after age 18, and there is a standard scale for that, we looked at the literature and picked a scale, and I'm going to just skip ahead a couple slides just for the sake of quickness of time. The scale that we embedded had 9 items on them. We pulled out there is a homelessness and residential instability component to this. We pulled that out as a separate question, and I'll explain that more in a little bit. So it's small to see, but parents, divorce or separation, lived with a family member with a substance abuse problem, lived with a family member with mental health, household member in prison or jail, witnessed domestic violence, death of a parent or primary caregiver, lived with a family member with a physical disability, exposed to community violence, or child protective services involvement. So that's what we were looking at here. Let's see, there we go. So about half of our sample, remember these are kids ages 3 to 5, about half of our sample had an ACE score of 3 or more. Just let that sink in. When we ran this data, I sat at my dining room table and cried. Honest to God, I've been doing homelessness work for 15, 20 years now, and I sat at my table, and it's just a staggering amount of adverse exposure in children who were very, very young. And this does not include, so that 3+ does not include the fact that the kids are all homeless and have really high rates of residential instability, which we asked about as a separate question. And about half the kids had moved more than 4 times. 21% had moved 6 or more times. 32%, 4 to 5 moves. There were 7% who had never moved, and 40% who had 2 to 3 moves. So this is a highly mobile population. So with our research hats on, we wondered what happens when you look at residential instability and you look at ACE scores. And what we found is that for every increase in housing instability, children moved up by half an ACE. Those were related. And then we know that caregivers can buffer or not this. So we looked at the relationship between a child's ACE score and what was going on for their caregiver. And what we found, and so remember, we're measuring these things for parents and these things for children. And what we found is that the ACE score has an impact on the children's development, independent of what was going on for the parent. About half the effect was mediated through the parent, and about half was direct. So parents do have a buffering role about half the time, is what it seems like from our data. Based on this information, so right now the Ness tool includes these 9 things. If we were to propose what we would call an expanded Ness ACE scale, we would recommend, based on our data, that a Ness scale include all of these 9 things that I just read a few minutes ago, and 2 other questions. Has your child ever experienced homelessness? And how many times has your child moved in a lifetime? Because you can see that the exposure does have an impact on development. Again, not surprising, but it's amazing to me how much housing and residential instability just gets left out completely out of the conversation for kids. And kids who are living in poverty have high rates of mobility, and it does have an impact on them. So let's talk very quickly about scoring, and then we're going to do a little demo.
So obviously, as you're looking and listening to all of this, it really, especially the ACE data, brings home the issue that we have to be addressing things at a family system level and looking at that family, because even ACEs and the outcome on the child is being affected by the caregiver and how it's affecting the caregiver and affects their parenting. So you can't just look at the experience of the child. You have to look at that same experience of the child and its effect on the parent and that effect on the child. So we go back to a system-based ecological perspective. So then we said, okay, let's go back to the logic model and how do we score this? So we scored this using this age-adjusted kind of method, the logic model, and we generated these weights with this statistical kind of model so that you were able to add a weight for if a child had more environmental risk or a child had caregiver risk. There were certain weights that were added to what their potential risk outcome was, because we were seeing them in context. There were a few items that were flagged that if you responded yes to a certain number of these items, it was it put you at a critical state, and you were automatically, there's usually critical items in a good assessment tool, these kind of automatically put you up at that high risk level. So this is kind of a very short version of what an algorithm looks like, but you're putting the weighted value next to the child score. There's certain weights next to each of those constructs. There's the mental health and parenting combined for the caregiver. Then there's these, and when you put them all together with adjusted weights that's built into the statistical model, you will end up getting an overall Ness score that is 0, 1, or 2, low, moderate, or high risk. So it's a big kind of algorithm that's 10 pages long and talks about how these weights. But one thing we were really careful of with the weights is that when you're looking at a child, the parent and their living, that they're already impacting that child, right? So we're not doubling up by measuring the caregiver risks and the environment. We're weighting how much of an added influence we're putting on that in order to predict risk. And so that's what's built into the model. It's not a double down, it's a weighted influence. So put this practically, what would a parent see? You're not going to see 0, 1, 2 because 0 actually looks pretty bad, right? And it actually translates to low. But if we were to look at Johnny at age 4 and get his scores across the level, we'd see that if we just did a child screen and not looked ecologically, he doesn't look too bad, right? He's low, moderate, his self-regulation's good, his problem solving, his cognitive, social emotional, low risk, he's looking good. Got a little language stuff, we could probably beef that up a little bit with some in-home supports, but if we looked at that, we wouldn't be too worried, and we could put in some supports. But what if we look further out and we look at his mom? Now we see that she's dealing with moderate levels of depression, which require treatment, high levels of trauma, which are probably the basis for the depression, and yet she's holding it together. She's an effective parent, which is probably why he's looking, because it all matters in how the rubber meets the road and what you do with the family. So we see that she's probably buffering him, right, with some good parenting, but how long is that going to last depending on if her depression goes untreated? Then we took a look at this family's environment, and we see there's some big risks in housing and food insecurity, and this child has been exposed to ACEs. So now when you think about recommendations and how to support this family, you're not just getting him some language-based support, but you're treating this caregiver, and you're intervening at a community level, housing, helping them get stable, reducing the risk or secondary prevention around the ACEs, and making sure no more occur. So now we have a much more robust way of intervening with Johnny by looking at his family. The report will generate a parent report. We'll show you an example of that with very actionable, you hit submit at the end, and it's going to spit out a report to you. So that parent and professional are sitting next to each other, and they, in real time, get to talk about what does this family want to address? What's going to work for them? What does this mean? Not waiting 6-10 weeks for a provider and a psychologist to do a report to you. And there's an interpretation guide about how to understand these results. So I'll let Katie give you a sense of what Ness looks like.
All right. So the timing of this, just so you all know, we're still tweaking things. So I have screenshots. I can't do a live demo because our developer actually, as of like 20 minutes before this presentation, was still emailing me saying, don't tinker with anything. So you log in, very straightforward. It's an online platform. And there's different dashboards depending on your level of access. So you could have a regular user, you could have an administrator, or you could have a senior administrator. The way that, and I'll show you a few structures for this in a little bit. So the senior admin dashboard, you have a whole bunch of ways to manage your staff, invite new staff, reassign staff, actually conduct Nest, take an intake, and look at your results. But you can also run a series of reports. You can run a Nest history on a child. So if you've been working with a child since they were 3 and they're 5.5, you can look back at how that child was doing at 3, 3.5, 4, et cetera. You can run a report to see how your staff is managing Nest, to say, okay, so Chelsea over here has 50 clients and she's done Nests on 12 of them or whatever. And then you can also run reports by department and program, and I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. But this is kind of your home page here. If you are just a regular plain old user, teacher or case manager without administrative responsibilities, this is what your dashboard looks like. You can create a new intake. These are some old buttons, but you can click on Nest history. You'll note that all of the children's names have stars on them. That's just to protect confidentiality a little bit. Going through there, And then you get to the you complete an intake form that's pretty standard online, name, date of birth, that kind of thing. And then you get to Nest, and this is what it looks like. There are 4 questions on each page. You hit previous page, you hit continue. The first one is, can your child catch a large ball with both hands? It starts off in a really non-intimidating sort of way. We did that really intentionally. These are parents love to talk about their kids. I could talk about my kids all day, right? So do we all. So these those go through the developmental questions. You can see the domain that you're on is up here. Part 1 of 3 has this many questions. There's always a log out button at the top, so if something happens and you want to log out really quickly, that's fine. The data does save every time you hit continue, which is a nice feature. And then, like I said, we put in a fairly sophisticated reporting structure so that Nest can be outfitted for a variety of kinds of systems and organizations. So when you sign up for Nest, there's a system admin who helps set up the system, run the logins, all those kinds of things, gives permissions. And then you can set up senior admins. So that would be like the department level person. The department admins can designate program admins so they can run report for their programs, and then there's regular users. So this is fascinating to me because we helped create the structure, but let's look at what it looks like. So in a small organization, you might have a systems admin and then a clinical director and the after-school director and then some teachers down here or the users or the case managers. In a more complex kind of system or a more complex organization, you could have a systems admin and a whole bunch of senior admins, VP of Homeless Services, Community Services, Behavioral Health. You might have all of the admins underneath there, and then quite a bit of users. So we tried to design it to be as flexible as possible to meet the needs of the very small programs that may want to use this, and then also the very large ones as well. It also works for school systems, so you might have each school has a senior admin login, and then each classroom has theirs underneath that. When you click from your dashboard, you can get reports. So this is the report that you would get for a particular child. When they administered it, the PDF of the report is saved in there, so you can look back. And let me show you what the report, hopefully I can do this here. Oh, it's there. Oh, that's beautiful. So like Carmela said, after you answer those 105 questions with the family and you click submit, a report pops up. And this is roughly what it looks like. This is a sample report. It's for Daniel Tiger. I couldn't bear to give him a developmental delay, though, when I did it. But anyway, you can see it'll have all the pertinent information here. It gives results with a table of contents. Now, here's my developmental task. Can I get the mouse over to the side so I can scroll down? Oh, there it is. All right, there we go. Can you scroll? I'm Mac-based, and I never use a PC, and my mouse goes opposite of what this one does. See the little bar there? Yeah. Just scroll down like a little bit. So you can see it gives you the results. Thanks for taking time to take Nest. And then it keeps going. Keep scrolling a little bit. And so it lays out each of the areas. Keep going a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit. There we go. So we describe it, it'll tell you what the risk is, and then when it goes a little further down, it actually bullet points, here are things that you can do with your child. Here are things where you might want some help. So for example, if your child has a language delay, there are things that you can do as caregiver with your child. Talk to them in the grocery store, read a ton of books, all the good literacy things that we were talking about this morning. But there may also be a need to get a more intensive assessment, and so it would break it down that way. You're not seeing that in all of this because this is just this is our mock-up report. But there it is. See, there's a caregiver. Yeah. And so it does the same for caregiver and it does the same for environment. There we go. All right. So that's what the report looks like, and the report gets saved in the dashboard. So at any point, if you're meeting with a family or if you want to look back on their history, you can do that. It also later on will give you a graph of how the child's doing over time. So if you can see this child at 3 was pretty high. By the time they get to 5, they got some good supports, and you can see how the child fares over time. We have similar graphs for the program and department levels as well. You can generate a program report that will tell you what the overall risk is for the children in your program aggregate, which is, I think, a really helpful tool, especially as we're talking to systems and funders and things like that, to say, hey, 90% of our caregivers are really struggling. And so here's why we're asking for these things. And we know because we use the psychometrically valid screening tool to, right, you can make the case that way. You can also do your planning accordingly then. There's a staff report, like I mentioned, that just gives you some administrative data for using Ness and embedding it into your system. So that was a very quick Ness demo. I'm going to let Carmela close us out, and then we'll take some questions.
So we think there's some strengths and obviously some limits, like with any tool. We're 100% sensitivity. Really, this tool came from the ground experience. So it combines practical experience with empirical knowledge to bring together and create it. And the providers and families spoke to us, really told us that this was helpful. That for providers, especially who don't know how to have these conversations, it acted as a structured communication tool about issues they didn't know. One user said that they had no idea a mother was feeling depressed, and using this tool, she was able to talk about it, and this was just during the study. And I had parents where I did most of the gold standard testing, and I had parents who said, I wish that we had people ask us these questions earlier, because my kid is now in 3rd grade and struggling, and we're asking them about their 2nd child. So we felt like, and from a user perspective, we wanted it to fit in the system, in the workflow. Otherwise, people aren't going to use it. Limitations, of course, it is a sample of convenience on the smaller side, but the analyses did kind of correct for that. It is parent report. Any parent report is always subject to some bias, but we tried to mitigate that with gold standards. And of course, right now it's for English-speaking families. So as a final thought, and to close this out, I believe strongly that the most potent solutions to social issues come from a combination of practical, on-the-ground experience combined with good literature and knowledge from the field, academic and research. It's not one or the other. I think if we over-rely on one or the other, we're often missing something, but when you bring that practical and that empirical together, you can get a really, really strong tool that is both solid and valid, but very practical for people who need it. And that's what we hope to do with Nest, is put this tool in the hands of people who are working directly with kids and families. This is our team. We're the co-creators and the co-principal investigators, our statistician and our research assistant. We were funded by the NICHD. It was IRB approved, and Nest will ultimately live at Katie's organization, the Center for Social Innovation, and that's where you'll be able to find it, and this is where you'll be able to contact us. Thank you very much.
So in our other lives, we are both teachers and trainers and don't usually talk this much without asking any questions at all. But you've got like 4 minutes for question and answers now. But anyway, if you have any questions and answers, we're happy to answer them.
I can talk a lot.
Okay. I'm going to repeat it in here.
Your map showed that one of your partners was in Central North Carolina, and I didn't know.
Yeah, so we partnered with a whole host of people in North Carolina. We partnered with the Salvation Army and Project Catch. Yeah. Yeah. Other questions? So the question is about whether the questions are done to the parents or the kids. It's the parents answering on behalf of the kids. So the kids, we actually recommend that the kids aren't even in the room, because when we get to the parent section, you're asking about trauma and depression, some sort of sensitive stuff. So it's meant to be parent report.
And just a note, the gold standards that we validated against are also parent report tools. So it wasn't like we validated against a screening tool where you actually screen the child directly. It's validated against other parent report tools that are already validated.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is about, have we created any tools that the parent can take with them? So the report, when it pops up, is printable and downloadable. We don't have a tool to send the data to the physician at this point, but the report is downloadable. And the report, we didn't scroll, the report's like 10 pages long. When you get to the last page of the report, it's actually a summary of all of the scores with a little bit more detail than maybe you would get into in a conversation with a parent, but it's got all of that detail there.
Yeah, we tried to make the report so that it's very family friendly, so a parent is able to read it with very practical strategies, but the back side of the report has the detailed summary of scores, so that if another tester, if you're bringing this and saying, folks said I should have my child screened, and as a psychologist, I could look at the data really quickly and be able to understand without reading the whole report.
Yeah. We would love to translate this into another language. We have about $6 left in our budget. I'm sure none of you can relate to that feeling. We would love to be able to translate it. It's a matter of getting funding for it. Yeah. We've had requests for Spanish. We've had requests for Creole.
And other age groups.
And other age groups, yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was going to ask is the test, assess from 3 to 5, but could it also be for other age groups, like slightly older?
No, so if you put a birth date in that is above 5.11, it kicks you out. And if you put one in that's below 3, it kicks you out, because it's really just developed for 3 to 5-year-olds at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I would be interested to know if you were able to identify if any of these people who were taking the Nest screening had also been involved with previous interventions, like early intervention with the 0 to 3 population. Was there any?
We didn't, it's a good question. We didn't ask about that when we were collecting the data. The criteria were just that you had to be homeless or recently housed within the last 30 days. So the nature of the homeless service system is that they don't get a ton of connections. So anecdotally, I could say, but
Yeah,
that's not
and I did a lot of the gold
yeah.
standards, so at least on almost 50 of the families, they would tell me lots of stories about other services that they had. And so they're there, but it's not, it wasn't a pointed question as part of this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Your norming group. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Did you cover that? I'm sure you covered it, but your sample?
So the question is how we developed our norming group and our sample. Do you want to?
So the sample is from, we recruited families nationwide for parents of kids who were 3 to 5 years old, who were experiencing homelessness or actually recently housed. We gave a 30-day window so that really we were targeting high poverty groups, homeless or recently housed, to kind of capture that, and English speaking. And so that was the group on which we developed all the psychometrics for the tool. Yeah.
The N was 230.
230.
Yeah, and the thinking behind using the homelessness service system is that it intersects with so many different, and it's such a vulnerable population. So
Yeah, some of the kids were in
Exactly,
a
it's a
homeless
proxy.
system. Some of the kids were recently housed. Some of the kids were in child care centers that actually were living in shelters, but we went to the child care center. So there were child care providers who filled it out. There were homeless service providers who filled it out, and there were folks who were going into homes who filled it out. So from a workforce perspective, we were trying to make sure that it was feasible, that it could integrate into a variety of systems.
So that's almost getting at my question, which is, I noticed that you had sites sort of scattered across the country, including one maybe in DC, which is where I'm from.
Virginia.
Virginia. So did you have local community-based partners who were then helping you recruit families? Like, what was the sampling frame? Not to get too nerdy.
we could talk about Nest all day long. You're welcome to.
Yeah, so the providers themselves
Yes.
were like, we provided some flyers, we provided information.
Yeah, so we wanted a nationwide. We wanted to work nationwide. We have relationships with programs across the country, and so we
reached out
we
to
reached
folks
out
that
to
we
programs
knew.
and described it and told them what would be involved and what training and support we would provide. And
Right. So it
yeah.
wasn't a randomized kind of sample across
Yeah.
providers, but we reached out to people in different states, and these were the ones that were able to jump on board.
I'm guessing it was probably
Yeah.
in the neighborhood of 15 programs we reached out to, and
Yeah.
probably about 9.
Yep.
Yeah.
I know there's another presentation, so maybe last question.
Yeah.
So just to follow up on that last thought, did you get feedback from the providers who piloted your instrument on the utility from their perspective?
Yes, they loved it. Very short. So we got feedback at each stage from providers and from parents, and I mean, the short way of saying it is the providers loved it. I mean, they were eager to use it, and can you give this to us? And we'd say, well, we haven't run the analysis yet, and it's not final on the platform. They'd say, that's okay, we're okay with that. And we'd say, no, you really can't have it until it's finished. Yeah. One more. Yeah.
Depression, with high depression, you have a kid that is living in a shelter that is not getting appropriate food or access to medical health care. What is the final goal? Can the service coordinator, can they do something with this as a proof to get them services, all the services they need?
Yeah, so what we're hoping is that this helps providers have a way to target what services are needed. What typically happened for me when I was working in this environment is staff would just see a kid and say, refer to early intervention. And so it was 100% referral to early intervention, but not 100% of kids needed that. And then we were missing all these other things. So the idea is to be in low resource settings when you do not have the resources to hit a lot of things. Where's the bang for the buck? How are we going to help this kid? And we wanted to be able to help people have better targeted referrals to meet the needs of kids and families with the long-term idea of reducing risk and building resilience. And we're hoping that Nest helps people do that. Thank you so much for coming. We really appreciate it. Thank you.